Northern California coast. September 1945. Fog damp and salt sweet on the air. Pine silhouettes fade into gray. Somewhere downhill, ocean surf repeats like a slow heartbeat. The dawn came cautiously that morning, hesitant behind the fog. Perimeter lights clicked off one by one until only the kitchen windows stayed bright. From those rectangles poured the first sound of the day metal against metal, a steady rhythm of ladles and spoons. Then, the unmistakable whisper of boiling rice. For months, Camp Rosalind had smelled of field rations, oatmeal, burnt coffee, and canned meat fried dry for protein's sake. But today, the air turned unfamiliar. Something drifted through the barracks, narrow as a dream, warm and slightly sweet soy and fish and salt. A fragrance carried on steam that crawled beneath doors and over wool blankets. It reached every cot before the bugle ever blew. Sergeant Aki Tanaka opened her eyes to it and froze. She'd forgotten there were scents that didn't demand vigilance. In Manila, before capture, mornings were all gun oil and radio static. Here, the smell triggered a reflex she'd buried under orders, hunger linked to gentleness. She sat up, still half guard, half daughter of a vanished house, and listened to an old part of herself asking quietly, "Could that be our food?" Down the corridor came voices, American, female, unhurried. One said, "They'll love it, I hope." Another laughed. "Smells funny, but the lieutenant swears that's how it's supposed to smell." The conversation cut off when they noticed prisoners clustering near the threshold like ghosts unsure of haunting rites. Boots squeaked against wet planks. The women in gray uniforms stood motionless, confused by the rush of longing. Fog pressed against the mess hall windows when the door finally swung open. Inside, steam gathered thick enough to blur edges into halos. On every table waited bowls, porcelain chipped, yet shining pale, each filled with white rice, civilized into shape by precise scoops. Next to it, a strip of grilled fish, skin crisp, sauce glazing its edge amber. It looked impossible. Corporal Ellen McCarthy, the cook assigned to Women's Catering Unit 6, wiped her forehead and stepped aside for the first line of prisoners. She had followed the Army manual except for one risky choice. She'd borrowed ingredients from a Japanese grocer 2 towns over, confiscated produce returned in quiet apology. Now the mess smelled like someone else's memory, and that frightened her more than cold stares ever had. At her signal, the interpreter called softly, "Breakfast ready." "Please." Enjoy his accent made the last word tremble. Aki Tanaka walked forward because no one else moved. Her boots sounded too loud on the planks. She stopped before the tables, stared at the bowls as if at a photograph of the impossible. The rice caught the light, every grain distinct, perfectly ordinary, perfectly devastating. She bowed slightly out of reflex, not to the Americans or the guards, but to the reunion itself. When she picked up the chopsticks, her hands betrayed her. They shook as if recalling every meal before war starved the gesture out of her. She lifted one grain. It stuck to wood by steam. She tasted. Her throat clenched. Salt met sweetness, not richness, not excess, just recognition. It was her country breathing through the surface of defeat. Across from her, a younger corporal, Mio Sato, whispered a laugh that turned to sob so swiftly it startled the room. The sound spread contagiously, shoulders trembling, muffled weeping hidden behind sleeves. The Americans stared, bowls in hand, not sure whether to comfort or retreat. Corporal McCarthy looked to her superior for guidance and found none. She reached behind her to turn off the burner's hiss, leaving only quiet and the private, unbearable sound of people remembering home. The fog outside thinned. sunlight slowly threading through wire like threads of spun glass. Camp Rosalind woke not to bugle or roll call, but to the realization that mercy can weigh as heavy as loss. Rosalind was a compromise between fear and decency. Built in 1943 out of pine and corrugated metal, it rested on a bluff 20 miles from the ocean. Officially, it was a naval auxiliary internment site for special female enemy personnel. In plain terms, women who had once served the Empire of Japan. 312 prisoners lived here by the time the war ended. Nurses from Saipan, clerks captured on Guam, communication aides from Manila, a handful of Army auxiliaries taken with the troops they followed. They had drilled themselves to obey silence, even in defeat. Even captivity was approached like another assignment. Mind straight, back straight, words weighed. The daily rhythm suited them. At 600, the bugle wailed from the guard barracks, a lonely note that forgot whether it called to enemies or friends. The women lined up by rank outside their huts, gray uniforms pinned with improvised insignia made from thread. At 700, they worked laundry for the hospital, translation of captured Japanese documents, gardening near the fence line where cabbage kept its own counsel. At noon, a whistle started lunch, stew and brown bread, never enough salt. By lights out, the camp sounded like any other military post, orderly, obedient, haunted by its own efficiency. It was not cruelty that shaped Camp Rosalind. It was paradox. Every rule of confinement carried a faint echo of respect. The Americans patrolled but rarely barked orders. They were women, 2 members of the Women's Army Corps, most of them former teachers, typists, or farmhands. They recognized posture, recognized fatigue. War had taught them how small authority feels when uniforms disguise the sameness of worry. Inside the barracks, the smell of American soap, starch, tobacco mingled with Japanese linen and medicinal salve. Each woman kept her corner immaculate. Blanket folded to a hand's width, tin mirror balanced on the crate that served as dresser. The smallest things became country. Hairpins, sewing needles, a square of silk hidden inside a pillowcase. At night, voices traded lullabies in whispers, not rebellious but devotional, proof that identity could live without flag. Letters arrived sporadically, censored and late. One read, "Father's store gone. Heat from sky worse than shellfire." Another, simply, "We wait." Most women stopped writing replies. Paper was too dry to absorb what they needed to say. The Americans noticed, but didn't understand. Corporal McCarthy, the cook whose skillet had summoned the smell of Tokyo that morning, had grown up behind a diner counter in Fresno. To her, food equaled comfort. Give anyone a taste of home, and comfort follows like a dog to scraps. That logic worked for homesick soldiers. It failed for those whose homes no longer existed. Still, even among compassion, distance ruled. Guards and prisoners shared the same sky, but not conversation. When it rained, both took shelter under overhangs facing opposite directions. Occasionally, curiosity cracked the silence. A whack on laundry inspection asked, "What music do you like?" A prisoner replied through interpreter, "Silence." The guard had smiled, thinking it a joke. It wasn't. Silence was the only thing they could still command. Beyond the fence, the American West continued in different routines. Farm trucks passed twice a day, carrying feed supplies. Fishermen in oilskin jackets sometimes waved from the coastal road. To them, Camp Rosalind looked tidy, harmless, another invisible part of a war already won. Yet inside, victory remained theoretical. The prisoners existed between categories. Not enemies now, not citizens yet, suspended like fog between ocean and sky. The cultural translation failed most vividly at meals. When Americans said food, they meant portions. When Japanese soldiers said food, they meant morale. Rice was not nutrition. It was order. It was ceremony. It was the body remembering what command once felt like. So when the camp's new supplies replaced barley mush with true short-grain rice, the shift struck like thunder under the skin. A homeland rendered edible only deepened loss. That bitter tenderness marked every routine. During English class delivered by an Army volunteer, a lesson once included the word home. The translator hesitated. There was no clean equivalent left to speak. He settled on uchi, a word that can mean both house and inside oneself. It fit too well. Small storms defined the weeks. One guard learned to write names in Japanese script. One prisoner practiced good morning until pronunciation softened. A fence separates, but grammar leaks. The whole camp became a crucible where courtesy and mistrust simmered together, the essence of 1945 distilled into one improbable piece. Each evening the sun sank into water beyond the hills, gold bleeding into blue. From the guard towers, it looked as if the Pacific swallowed the entire notion of revenge. From the barracks doors, it looked like Japan calling across half an ocean of light. The war had paused, but restoration had not yet begun. Before understanding could happen, there had to be a meal no one expected and no one forgot. Routine returned, but never quite the same. The once harmless smell of grain porridge now felt like an apology. Every kitchen sound, metal, water, steam summoned hesitation. After that meal, silence became the camp's common language. Sergeant Aki Tanaka's composure slipped in increments. The officers' lessons for the younger auxiliaries grew shorter, sentences trailing off mid-word. In the barracks, she caught herself folding blankets too gently, as though expecting civilian life to resume if the corners aligned. Her authority, sharpened by 3 faithful years of allegiance, now dulled against the ache of homesickness awakened by kindness. No punishment could have weakened her as much as generosity did. Corporal Ellen McCarthy watched from the mess doorway each morning. She respected discipline. She recognized heartbreak in straight spines. Her orders were simple. Keep meals balanced, nothing fancy, no more special menus unless HQ requested. But she and her fellow WAC cooks had broken that rule once, and curiosity had turned to guilt. She still remembered the chorus of quiet sobs rising from that room, like a hymn none of them understood the words to. Some nights she woke hearing it again, the sound of nostalgia mistaken for comfort. Weeks folded into new weather. The fog retreated. Days brightened, that harsh coastal light exposing every imperfection the gray used to blur. Prisoners weeded frost-burned cabbages, repaired fences, translated prisoner rosters, tended the camp infirmary. Order had been restored on paper, yet something invisible had shifted. Mercy given too unexpectedly had forced both sides to renegotiate who they were. Aki found small ways to claim the memory without surrendering to it. She trimmed a square of cloth from a worn blanket, folded it into a pouch, and filled it with half a handful of rice saved from that breakfast. At night, she kept it near her pillow, a relic lighter and more dangerous than any weapon. Food had turned sacrament. McCarthy, meanwhile, began studying Japanese phrases from an Army pamphlet, practicing in the storage pantry so the sergeant of the day wouldn't hear. She learned Ohio, arigato, and aishu melancholy. She couldn't pronounce them yet, but writing them down felt like penance. Then came the second reversal. News arrived that Japanese forces in the Philippines had formally surrendered weeks earlier than expected. Headquarters relayed a new mandate. Repatriation would begin before winter. Families of prisoners of war would receive parcels through the Red Cross, small gestures of international courtesy. Camp Rosalind's staff was instructed to assemble gifts of equal kind. McCarthy saw her chance to heal what had broken. She proposed letting the prisoners prepare traditional food parcels themselves under supervision. The commander hesitated. "Won't that stir up old feeling again?" "It will," McCarthy replied, "but maybe it should." They need to taste goodbye. Approval came with conditions. 2 days only. Ingredients rationed. Every item inspected. On the morning of preparation, the camp smelled half like Japan, half like America fish and coffee wrestling in the damp air. The women grated ginger, toasted seaweed, rolled rice balls around umi paste. Guards helped cut paper squares for wrapping. During inspection lunch, a few brave WACS tasted what they'd made faces startled at the unfamiliar balance of salt and softness. Then the laughter came, small and real, like language finally breaking free of grammar. For those hours, lines blurred. Photographs from that afternoon, later misfiled in supply archives, show women of both uniforms bent over the same table, hands dusty with flour. If not for the wire visible through the window behind them, one might mistake it for an international cooking class. But contradiction thrives best at its gentlest moments. That evening, while the parcels cooled, rain drums began again. A courier jeep arrived carrying official memos. Repatriation delayed until spring. Transport shortage. When the interpreter announced it, the camp exhaled half relief, half mourning. The moment of reunion had been postponed indefinitely. Back in the mess hall, Aki stared at the finished boxes, hundreds of them, labeled in careful script. For mothers, / for sisters, / for schools gone. The paper softened under humidity. One tear in the corner let rice grains spill like sand through an hourglass. She crouched, trying to catch them, whispering an apology to each runaway seed. McCarthy crossed the floor and knelt beside her. Without translator or etiquette, she pressed her own palm to the damp wood, helping gather what couldn't be saved. Their heads bowed in the same motion. Raindrops tapped the roof in uneven rhythm. Somewhere outside, a guard dog barked, reminding everyone that mercy still required supervision. Later, in the canteen, the Americans talked quietly over bad coffee. A private asked, "What broke 'em worse, losin' the war or tastin' home?" McCarthy answered without looking up, "Same thing, I think." As winter edged near, the camp learned to live with its strange balance sorrow measured against grace. Every small kindness risked collapse. Every restraint threatened to turn people to stone. Yet between those limits, something human insisted on surviving. Each evening, when lamps flickered to life in neat rows, the smell of rice still found a way to rise through the vent shafts even when none was cooking. It became Camp Rosalind's ghost, an aroma of remembered generosity that refused exile. Guards teased about it. "The place'll always smell like soup." But when the wind blew through pine and seaweed together, everyone paused before laughing. No one wanted to be the first to name homesickness aloud. 6 months remained before repatriation. Enough time for strangers to finish learning that compassion, like salt, burns as much as it heals. The order for transfer came quietly typed, double-spaced, unceremonious. All female Japanese personnel to embark via San Francisco for repatriation forthwith. For the Americans, it was another rotation, another set of lists to tick. For the women, it was the end of time itself. Preparations began with the usual bureaucracy signature, inspection, inventory. But the atmosphere carried something ritualistic, almost reverent. Guards cleaned the barracks with as much care as the prisoners who'd lived there. Uniforms were laundered to a dull newness, insignia removed. At every doorway, sunlight poured in like absolution. Sergeant Aki Tanaka stood outside her hut holding a small parcel, a handful of rice wrapped in cloth, the keepsake she had carried since that first morning of remembered taste. It weighed nothing, yet it grounded her more than the boots she wore. She felt the texture through fabric, the coolness, the fragility, and realized she was touching both ends of her life at once. Corporal McCarthy met her on the parade ground. Everything between them had condensed into gesture. They rarely spoke beyond instruction, yet their silences fitted seamlessly. McCarthy handed over a bundle she'd prepared herself, hardtack, coffee sweets, and 3 folded letters written carefully in both languages. On top lay a single American mess spoon, shined so bright it threw white into Aki's eyes. "You might need one," McCarthy said simply. The translator wasn't present. Tone itself translated. Aki smiled in the manner of soldiers who have nothing left to defend, deep, tired, grateful. At noon, the trucks idled along the main road outside the fence. Engines coughed smoke into flawless air. The departing column formed quietly, luggage stacked with regulation precision. Behind the wire, every motion mirrored the pre-war drills that had once prepared them for battle. Now it prepared them for return. As they climbed aboard, the memorial smell of the camp's final breakfast drifted one last time. Rice and miso simmered thin for everyone, guards included. McCarthy had insisted. No one objected. Some of the women ate. Some, like Aki, held the bowl near their face just long enough to breathe it in before setting it down. For each woman, the sensation meant something different. Forgiveness, surrender, homesickness shaped into warmth. When the trucks lurched into motion and the gate clanged behind them, conversation dissolved. The hills rolled past green now, alive with new chutes. Occasionally, an American driver glanced through the rear mirror at rows of quiet faces, wondering what sight met their gaze beyond the glass. A few hours later, they reached the port. The ship's hull loomed black and vast, its gangway lined with Red Cross nurses. Wind pressed the women's coats against their knees. Someone murmured, "Furusato no kaori ga nai." Home has no smell. Another answered, "It will, when the rice cooks again." The sentences evaporated into the crowd's shuffle. Before boarding, McCarthy approached Aki one final time. The sun pinned their shadows together on the dock. Neither saluted. Neither bowed. They simply stood in the wind's awkward embrace, shared the briefest touch of forearms contact enough to admit kinship beyond command. Then Aki turned and walked up the gangway, her steps measured not by distance, but by restraint. Months later, Japanese newspapers printed brief notes about women repatriates from the United States, healthy, silent, described as courteous. No column mentioned their smiles at first taste of home, or how mercy can terrify before it consoles. The official record stayed clean. Only diaries held the truth. Years passed. The camp dismantled, its timber sold, the site swallowed by pine. Tourists now stopping on the bluff hear birds louder than memory. Yet some mornings, old residents swear a trace of soy still drifts when fog rolls in from the sea, just a hint, like history reheating itself. In spring 1965, a letter arrived at an address long missing its mailbox number. One page in fading ink, signed A. Tanaka. It ended with a line McCarthy had once written in her English practice book. Good food never forgets who shared it. War changed the world through destruction, but sometimes it redeems itself through one quiet act, a bowl of familiar food given in foreign mercy. It reminds us that empathy can taste like loss and still feed what survives inside.